Some stories feel cold long after they're told, not because of the facts, but because of the feeling. This one crawled in slow, with rattling shutters, locked doors, and the kind of silence that doesn't mean safety. It wasn't just a case, it was a warning that evil sometimes wears a familiar face, and sometimes it slithers. Tonight's investigation? The adventure of the Speckled Band. It was early April, 1883, when I woke to find Holmes beside my bed, fully dressed and already deep in thought. The fire in our sitting room hadn't yet been stirred, and the morning light was still gray with sleep. Holmes was rarely up before me, and never without cause. "Sorry to wake you, Watson," he'd said, his voice low but urgent. "But it seems we've all been aroused early today. Miss Hudson was knocked up. She passed it on to me, and now I pass it on to you." I blinked at him, still half in dreams. "What is it? A fire?" "No, a client. A young lady, quite agitated. She insists on seeing me immediately. She's waiting in the sitting room now." He paused, then added, "When a woman wanders London before dawn and knocks on strange doors, it's rarely for anything trivial. If it proves interesting, I thought you might want to be in from the start." I was already throwing off the covers. "You know I wouldn't miss it." There was no greater thrill than watching Holmes work, watching the way his mind moved, swift and precise, like a blade through fog. I dressed quickly, and within minutes we were descending the stairs to the sitting room. She was waiting by the window, dressed in black, her face hidden behind a heavy veil. She rose as we entered, and even before she spoke, I could feel the tension radiating from her like a wire pulled too tight. "Good morning, madam," Holmes said gently. "My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is my friend and associate, Dr. Watson. You may speak freely in front of him." He gestured to the fire. "Miss Hudson had the good sense to light it. Please come closer, you're shivering." "It's not the cold," she said, her voice low and strained. "It's fear. It's terror." She lifted her veil, and I saw a face drawn thin by sleepless nights. Her eyes were wide and restless, her skin pale, her hair streaked with gray that didn't belong to her age. She looked like someone who had been hunted, not by a man, but by something worse, something she couldn't name. Holmes studied her with that quiet, piercing gaze of his. Then he leaned forward and placed a hand gently on her forearm. "You mustn't be afraid," he'd said. "We'll set things right, I have no doubt." He glanced at her gloves. "You came by train this morning?" She blinked. "You know me then?" "No, but I see the second half of a return ticket in your left glove, and the mud on your sleeve. 7 fresh splashes, all on the left side. Tells me you rode in a dog cart along a wet road before reaching the station." She stared at him, stunned. "You're quite right. I left home before 6, reached Leatherhead at 20 past, and caught the first train to Waterloo." She paused, then added, "I've heard of you, Mr. Holmes, from Miss Farintosh. You helped her once, when no one else could. She gave me your name." Holmes nodded. "Yes, the case of the opal tiara. I remember it well." She took a breath, steadying herself. "I don't have the means to pay you now, but in a month or so, I'll be married. I'll have my own income, I promise. I won't forget your help." Holmes waved it off. "My profession is its own reward, but you may cover any expenses at your convenience. Now, please, tell us everything." She hesitated, then began. And as she spoke, the fire crackled low, and the shadows in the room seemed to lean in closer. "My name is Helen Stoner," she began, her voice steady, despite the tremble in her hands. "And I live with my stepfather, Dr. Grimsby Roylott, at Stoke Moran in Surrey." Holmes gave a slight nod. "The name's familiar." "It would be," she said. "The Roylotts were once one of the oldest Saxon families in England. Wealthy, respected, but that was long ago. The last few generations squandered everything. Gambling, drink, worse. By the time my stepfather inherited the estate, there was little left but the house and a few tangled acres of land. She paused, her eyes distant. He adapted, took a medical degree, went to India, and built a practice there. He was brilliant, I think. Respected. But something happened. A robbery, they said. He killed a servant in a fit of rage. Beat him to death. He barely escaped the gallows, spent years in prison. When he came back to England, he was changed. She folded her hands in her lap, fingers tightening. He married my mother while in India. She was a widow, Miss Stoner, the wife of Major General Stoner of the Bengal Artillery. My sister Julia and I were just 2 years old, twins. When we returned to England, she died in a railway accident. That was 8 years ago. Her voice caught, but she pressed on. After her death, he gave up any pretense of practicing medicine, took us to Stoke Moran. The house was crumbling, but the money she left was enough for our needs. There should have been peace, but there wasn't. She looked up at us, her eyes hollow. He changed again, grew violent, isolated. The villagers feared him. He fought with anyone who crossed him. Once he threw a blacksmith into a stream. I had to pay the man off to avoid another scandal. No one would work for us. Julia and I did everything ourselves. Holmes leaned forward, slightly, listening without a word. He kept strange company, gypsies. He let them camp on the grounds. Sometimes he'd vanish with them for days. And he kept animals. Indian creatures, a cheetah, a baboon. They roamed freely. We locked our doors at night. She took a breath, steadied herself. 2 years ago, Julia became engaged. A kind man. A retired major. Our stepfather didn't object, but 2 weeks before the wedding, she died. Holmes' eyes narrowed. Tell us everything. I remember every detail, she said. The bedrooms are on the ground floor, my stepfather's, then Julia's, then mine. No connecting doors, all open into the same corridor. That night, he went to his room early. We could smell his cigars, strong, Indian tobacco. Julia came to my room. We talked about her wedding. She seemed happy. Helen's voice dropped. Then, she stood to leave. She paused at the door. Helen, she asked, have you ever heard anyone whistle in the night? I told her no. She said she'd heard it 3 nights in a row, around 3 in the morning, a low, clear whistle. She couldn't tell where it came from. The lawn, maybe, or the next room. She locked her door, as always. I couldn't sleep. Something felt wrong. Then, Helen's hands clenched. Then I heard her scream. She stared into the fire as if seeing it all again. I ran into the corridor. Her door was opening. She staggered out, her face twisted in terror. She collapsed into my arms, convulsing. She gasped. It was the band. The Speckled band. Then she pointed toward my stepfather's room and died. The room was silent. Holmes spoke softly. The coroner found no cause. None. The door was locked from the inside, the windows barred. No marks on her body. No poison, nothing. And the whistle? I told them. They said it was the wind, or my imagination. Holmes' gaze sharpened. And now? 2 nights ago I was moved into Julia's old room. Repairs, they said. Last night I heard it, the whistle, just as she described. She looked at Holmes, her voice barely a whisper. I'm afraid, Mr. Holmes. I'm afraid I'll be next. Holmes was silent for a long moment. Then he reached out and gently lifted the lace cuff from her wrist. 5 bruises, finger marks. You've been hurt, he said. She pulled the sleeve down quickly. He doesn't know his own strength. Holmes stood, his face unreadable. This is a deep business. But we've no time to waste. If we came to Stoke Moran today, could we examine the rooms without your stepfather knowing? She nodded. He's in town. He won't return until evening. Then we'll be there this afternoon. Watson? Of course. She stood, her voice lighter now. Thank you. Just telling you has lifted the weight. She lowered her veil and slipped from the room. Holmes watched the door close behind her. Then he turned to me. Well, Watson, what do you make of it? I shook my head. It's a dark and sinister business. Holmes nodded. And we've only just begun. The room had barely settled after Helen's departure when the door burst open with a force that rattled the glass in its frame. A man stood in the threshold, tall, broad, and coiled with fury. His clothes were a strange blend of country and city, a black top hat, a long frock coat, and high gaiters caked with mud. In one hand he held a hunting crop, which he swung like a man used to striking with it. His face was a map of violence, deep lines carved by the sun and rage, a hawk-like nose, and eyes that burned with something far more dangerous than anger. They burned with control barely held. "Which of you is Holmes?" he demanded. Holmes didn't rise. He remained seated, calm as ever. "My name, sir." "And you have the advantage of me." "I am Dr. Grimsby Roylott, of Stoke Moran." Holmes gestured to a chair. "Then pray take a seat." "I will do nothing of the kind," Roylott snapped. "My stepdaughter has been here. I traced her. What has she been saying to you?" Holmes leaned back slightly. "It's a bit cold for the time of year, don't you think?" Roylott's eyes narrowed. "Don't play games with me! What has she told you?" Holmes smiled faintly. "I've heard that the crocuses are promising this spring." That did it. Roylott stepped forward, his voice rising to a roar. "You think you can mock me? I know who you are! Holmes the meddler! Holmes the busybody! Holmes the Scotland Yard jack-in-office!" Holmes chuckled. "Your conversation is most entertaining. When you leave, do close the door behind you. There's a draft." Roylott's face twisted. He stepped forward again, seized the iron poker from beside the hearth, and bent it into a curve with his bare hands. "See that you keep yourself out of my grip," he snarled, then hurled the twisted metal into the fireplace and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was thick with the echo of his presence. Holmes rose, walked to the hearth, and picked up the poker. With a sudden flex of his arm, he straightened it back into shape. "He seems a very amiable person," he said dryly. I stared at the poker. "You're not as bulky as he is." "No, but I dare say my grip is not much weaker." He turned back to the fire, his expression sharpening. "This gives zest to our investigation. I only hope Miss Stoner doesn't suffer for her courage in coming to us." He paused, then added, "And now, Watson, let's have breakfast. Afterwards I'll pay a visit to Doctor's Commons. I want to see the will of the late Miss Stoner. I suspect it may tell us more than her husband ever intended." Holmes returned just before 1 o'clock, a folded sheet of blue paper in his hand, and a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "I've seen the will," he said, tossing his coat aside, "and I've done the math." He dropped into his chair and spread the paper across his knee. "When Miss Stoner died, her income was just over £1,100 a year. Not a fortune, but enough to live comfortably. The will was clear. While her daughters remained unmarried and under Dr. Roylott's care, he would control the full amount. But if either of them married, a third of that income, £250, would go directly to her." I nodded. "So if both daughters married, he'd be left with barely half. And with agricultural prices falling, that half is now worth even less. I estimate his current income at around $750. If both girls married, he'd be reduced to $250, a pauper again, just like his father." Holmes folded the paper and tapped it against his palm. "He had every reason to prevent those marriages, and no scruples about how." I felt a chill settle in my chest. "You think he killed Julia to keep the money?" "I think he found a method that left no trace. I think he's preparing to use it again." Holmes stood and crossed to the window, staring out at the grey London street. This is no longer a matter of curiosity, Watson. It's a matter of urgency. The man knows we're involved now. He's already shown his hand and his strength. He turned back to me, his expression hardening. We leave for Stoke Moran immediately. Pack your revolver, and Elays number 2 if you have it. I raised an eyebrow. You expect trouble? I expect a man who bends pokers for sport, and I don't intend to be caught unprepared. He paused, then added with a faint smile. That and a toothbrush should be all we need. The train to Leatherhead rattled through the countryside, the windows fogged with spring chill. Holmes sat opposite me, arms folded, chin tucked low, his eyes half-lidded in thought. He didn't speak, didn't need to. The case was unfolding behind his eyes, piece by piece. We hired a trap at the station and drove through the winding Surrey lanes. The hedgerows were just beginning to green, and the scent of damp earth clung to the air. It should have been a peaceful ride, but the closer we drew to Stoke Moran, the heavier the silence became. Holmes broke it only once, tapping my shoulder and pointing across the fields. There, he said. A gray, time-worn manor rose from the slope, its gables jutting like broken teeth through the trees. One wing sagged in ruin, boarded and crumbling, the other still lived, barely. Smoke curled from a chimney, a few windows blinked behind drawn blinds. That's the house of Dr. Grimsby Roylott, the driver confirmed. Holmes nodded. And that's where we're going. We paid the man, and climbed a stile into the fields. A narrow footpath led us toward the house, where a lone figure waited near the edge of the lawn. It's Miss Stoner, Holmes said, shading his eyes. Right on time. She hurried to meet us, her face pale but lit with relief. I've been watching for you, she said. He's gone to town. He won't be back until evening. Holmes offered a reassuring nod. We've met him already. Her face drained of color. He followed me? It seems so, but he won't find us unprepared. She led us across the lawn, past the overgrown hedges and the cracked stone path. The house loomed above us, its walls blotched with lichen, its windows like watching eyes. Holmes paused beneath the eaves, studying the layout. This is your old room, he said, pointing to the far window. The center was your sister's, and the one nearest the main building, his? Exactly. And you're now sleeping in the middle room. Yes, the repairs forced me to move. Holmes frowned. Repairs that don't seem urgent. They weren't. I think it was an excuse. Holmes said nothing, but his eyes narrowed. We entered through a side door and stepped into a narrow corridor, whitewashed and silent. The air was thick with dust and something else, something older, the kind of stillness that settles in place where fear has lived too long. Let's begin, Holmes said, and with that, he stepped into the room where Julia Stoner had died. The room was small, modest, a low ceiling, a narrow bed, a fireplace that hadn't seen flame in years. The air was stale, but not from disuse, from memory. It was the kind of room that remembered things it didn't want to. Holmes stepped inside first, his eyes already scanning the corners. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence was its own kind of reverence. This was Julia's room, Helen said softly, and now mine. Holmes nodded once, then moved to the window. Barred shutters, iron hinges, no way in or out once they're closed. He tested them, solid, immovable. Now the bed, he murmured. It sat low to the ground, pressed against the wall beneath a thick bell rope that hung down beside the pillow. Holmes gave it a tug. It didn't ring. Curious. It's not connected to anything. Helen frowned. I never noticed that. Holmes traced the rope upward with his eyes. It was looped through a hook just above a small opening in the wall. A ventilator? He said. But not to the outside. Connects to the next room. My stepfather's, Helen confirmed. Holmes' brow furrowed. Why install a ventilator between two rooms, and why place a bell rope directly beneath it? He dropped to the floor, crawling across the boards with his lens in hand. He examined the cracks, the paneling, and the floor beneath the bed. Then he stood and stared at the bed frame. It's clamped to the floor, he said. I blinked. So it can't be moved? Exactly. It must always remain beneath the rope, beneath the ventilator. He turned to Helen. When were these changes made? 2 years ago, around the time Julia died. Holmes' face darkened. Let's see the next room. We followed him into Dr. Roylette's chamber. It was larger, but no less sparse. A camp bed, a wooden chair, a table, a large iron safe in the corner. Holmes moved through like a man walking through a puzzle. He tapped the safe. What's in here? Business papers. At least that's what he told me. Holmes opened it. Empty, save for a saucer of milk. No cat, but a cheetah and a baboon. Still, this isn't for them. He crouched beside the wooden chair and examined the seat. Then he stood and crossed to the bed, where a dog lash hung from the bedpost, coiled and tied into a loop. Holmes held it up. What do you make of this, Watson? A lash? But why the loop? Holmes didn't answer. He stared at it for a long moment, then lowered it slowly. I've seen enough. We stepped back out into the corridor. Holmes' face was grim, his jaw set. Miss Stoner, you must do exactly as I say. Tonight, when your stepfather returns, pretend to have a headache. Lock yourself in your old room. Leave your lamp in the window as a signal. Then go to sleep in the room at the far end of the hall. Take everything you need. Do not return until morning. Helen nodded, pale but resolute. I will. Holmes turned to me. We'll stay at the inn across the field. From there, we'll see her signal, and then... He didn't finish the sentence. Holmes led us out of the room and onto the lawn. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees like whispers. I had never seen his face so grim. Watson, we're not dealing with madness. We're dealing with calculation. Cold, deliberate, and deadly. He looked back at the house. And tonight, we'll see just how far that calculation goes. The Crown Inn was quiet, its upper rooms dim and still. From our window, we could see the iron gates of Stoke Moran and the faint outline of the manor beyond. Holmes stood at the glass unmoving, watching the trees sway in the wind. At dusk, we saw Roylett return, his towering form hunched beside the boy who drove him. Even from a distance, we could hear his voice barking orders, fists clenched in fury. A light flared in the manor's sitting room. Then darkness swallowed it whole. Holmes turned from the window. It begins. We waited. Hours passed. The clock in the village struck 10, then 11, and then a light. A single lamp glowed in the middle window. Helen's signal. Holmes was already on his feet. Let's go. We crossed the field in silence, the wind cold against our faces. The park wall was broken in places, and we slipped through easily. The trees whispered above us. Somewhere in the dark, a branch cracked. A low, guttural growl echoed from the underbrush. The baboon, Holmes whispered. Keep your pistol ready. We reached the window and slipped inside. The room was exactly as we'd left it. The bed, the rope, the ventilator. Holmes closed the shutters and turned down the lamp until it barely glowed. Then he placed a candle, a box of matches, and a long, thin cane on the bed beside him. He leaned close to me, his voice a breath against my ear. Not a sound. Not a whisper. He mustn't know we're here. I nodded. Stay awake. Your life may depend on it. I took my seat in the corner, revolver in hand. Holmes sat on the bed, eyes fixed on the ventilator. And we waited. The room was silent, no creak, no breath, just the slow, steady beat of time. Outside, a night bird cried. Once something brushed against the shutters. A soft feline whine, the cheetah. The clock struck 12, then 1, then 2. And then, a light. A faint glow from the ventilator, the smell of burning oil. Heated metal. Holmes tensed. A soft hiss followed. Not loud, not sharp, just a steady whispering sound, like steam escaping from a kettle. Holmes struck a match and lashed out with his cane, furiously, repeatedly. striking the bell rope with violence I'd never seen in him. "You see it, Watson?" he shouted. "You see it!" But I saw nothing, only the flash of light, the blur of motion, the horror on Holmes's face. Then a scream. A sound like no other, a cry of pain, rage, and terror all at once. It rose like a storm, shook the walls, and then silence. Holmes stood frozen, his cane still raised. "It's over, and perhaps it's for the best." He turned to me, his voice steady now. The corridor was silent. As we stepped out of the bedroom, the lamp in Holmes's hand casting long shadows against the walls. The air felt heavier now, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Holmes knocked once on Roylott's door. No answer. He knocked again, louder. Still nothing. Then, without a word, he turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room was dim, lit only by the beam of a dark green lantern left open on the table. Its light fell across the iron safe, now ajar, and the wooden chair beside it. Dr. Grimsby Roylott sat in that chair, still, unmoving. His dressing gown hung loosely from his shoulders, his feet shoved into red Turkish slippers. Across his lap lay the dog lash, the same one Holmes had examined earlier. But it was no longer just a tool. It was a tether. Coiled around his brow, just above his eyes, was a band, a speckled band. It moved. I took a step forward, and the thing on his head uncoiled, slowly, deliberately. A squat diamond-shaped head rose from his hair, its tongue flicking the air. Holmes didn't flinch. "It's a swamp adder," he said quietly. "The deadliest snake in India." Roylott hadn't made a sound, not a cry, not a gasp, just a frozen stare locked in death. "He's been dead for minutes," Holmes said. 10 seconds after the bite, maybe less." He stepped forward, took the dog lash from Roylott's lap, and looped it around the snake's neck. The creature hissed once, but Holmes moved with precision, calm, practiced. He carried it at arm's length to the safe, dropped it inside, and shut the door. The click on the lock echoed like a final word. We stood in silence. Holmes looked down at the man who had twisted a poker in his bare hands, the man who had trained a serpent to kill. Violence does, in truth, recoil upon the violent, and the schemer falls into the pit he digs for another. He turned to me, his voice low. "Come. We need to get Miss Stoner to safety, and then the police." We left Stoke Moran at first light, the morning mist curling low over the fields like a shroud. Miss Stoner sat quietly across from us in the train carriage, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the passing countryside. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The weight had lifted, but the scar would remain. Holmes waited until we'd seen her safely into the care of her aunt at Harrow. Only then, as the train pulled away from the station, did he finally speak. "I owe you an explanation, Watson." I nodded. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't still trying to piece it all together. Holmes leaned back in his seat, folding his arms. "I was wrong at first. Hopelessly wrong. The gypsies, the word band. I let those details lead me astray. But once I realized the danger couldn't have come through the door or the window, the truth began to take shape." He turned to me, his eyes sharp even in the soft morning light. "The ventilator, the bell rope, the bed clamped to the floor. It was all a design, a channel, a path." "For the snake," I said. He nodded. "A swamp adder, the deadliest snake in India. No known antidote, no visible wound. A perfect weapon for a man like Roylott. Clever, cruel, and trained in Eastern methods." "But how did he control it?" "The whistle. He trained it to return at the sound, likely used the milk as a reward. Each night, he'd send it through the ventilator down the rope onto the bed. If it struck, the deed was done. If not, he'd call it back before daylight." I shuddered. "And Julia?" "She heard the whistle, saw the snake, and died before she could understand what she'd seen." Holmes looked out the window, his voice quieter now. "I suspected it before we ever left Baker Street. Her mention of the cigar smoke told me there had to be a connection between the rooms. The rest, the safe, the lash, the milk, confirmed it. And last night, I struck the rope to drive the snake back, but I must have hit it, agitated it. When it returned through the ventilator, it found Roylott waiting. He paused. And it did what it was trained to do. We sat in silence for a while, the rhythm of the train filling the space between us. Do you regret it? I asked. Holmes didn't answer right away. I regret that it came to this, he said at last. But not that it ended. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. Some men dig their own graves, Watson. Roylott just happened to line his with scales. Thank you for listening to this tale from the darker corners of Baker Street. If you felt the tension tighten around you, let me know. Likes and comments help this series breathe, and every voice adds to the mystery. If you want more stories told in a voice like no other, subscribe to the channel and keep the lantern burning. As always, a solemn thank you to my patrons, supporters who help each tale take shape and make it to your ears. If you'd like to see your name etched into the end credits of every future chapter, join the circle at Patreon. Until next time, lock the windows, watch the walls, and trust your instincts.